So today we're going to be talking about the differences in short-term rentals and long-term rentals. Stick around. So obviously there are a lot of differences when it comes to a short-term rental and a long-term rental. Let's dive right into the long-term rentals and talk about some of those pros. Pro number one being there are no setup costs. And what I mean by that is I don't need any furniture. I don't need to get the property ready. Actually, I want it to be vacant. So as soon as I find that tenant, I can slide them right in for that 1 to 2 year long lease. Number two pro of a long-term rental would be the lack of turnover, the lack of consistent fees and repairs and cleanings and all these things, because hopefully you've got a tenant in there for that 1 to 2 year lease and you're not constantly having to touch that property. Of course, occasionally something's gonna break, but you're not constantly having to clean it and do all these things on it. It's kind of one of those set it and forget it type rentals. Number three pro of a long-term rental, I would say, is probably the consistency in your passive income. So if you're managing a profit loss statement on a short-term rental, let's say for example, that's constantly gonna ebb and flow depending on how many bookings you get. Whereas a long-term rental, you should consistently, for the most part, be making the same thing over and over and over again. Of course, you're gonna have some repairs occasionally, but for the most part, you know exactly how much money's coming in. So we just talked about some of the pros in owning a long-term rental. Let's talk about a couple of the cons. One of the cons being, it probably won't be as lucrative as a short-term rental could be. Of course, short-term rentals are going to ebb and flow, but they can also be extremely lucrative depending on the season, location, where you're at, etc. You can demand a high rent. With a long-term rental, that consistency is key. So it may not be netting you the most money, but it's truly the consistency that's the pro. So you may not be able to make as much money as you would with a short-term rental. Another con being of a long-term rental is the potential for your tenants not to pay you. I mean, that really does stink. Whether they can't or whether we have something like COVID-19 that happens and they don't necessarily have to pay, especially if they lost their job, etc. If you find yourself in a tenant-landlord state and it's more tenant-verse, you may be stuck with an asset and a tenant not paying you and not paying you for long term. So you may have to hold on or make payments, cover mortgages, etc. Of course, that would be a con. Now let's swap over and talk about the pros of a short-term rental or an Airbnb or VRBO. Those things could be extremely, extremely lucrative. They really can. Depending on where you're actually located and time of year, you could be netting a lot per month. Let's talk about a cabin on a mountain near the slopes in January, for example. You could be asking $200, $300, $400 a night. That could quickly outnet you the amount that you're making on a long-term rental. So yes, you can demand high-end rent and they can be extremely lucrative. The second pro of owning a short-term rental, and probably one of my favorites, is that you get to use it as a vacation home. I'll say it again, you get to use it as a vacation home. As long as you are working on it, there's a certain amount of hours that you need to be actually physically working on your property. You can write it off for taxes because you're working on your property. So you can go visit the location, you can enjoy the home and hopefully all the amenities and the fun things that you're nearby, the attractions. And as long as you put in a little bit of elbow grease or work on it, you can write it off. Now let's talk about the cons of owning a short-term rental. Number one being the startup cost. The startup cost and the initial push to get it ready is and can be exhausting. Can you tell that I've been there before? Like, it is exhausting. So you purchase a home, it's vacant, and now I need to get it ready for tenants, and I need to get it ready for Airbnb or VRBO. I need it to look cute. You need furniture, you need kitchen accessories, you need artwork, you need linens, you need all the things. And to get that property ready takes a lot of energy and a lot of money. This next con may be a little controversial because I feel like it actually could be a pro and a con, but I'm sliding it under the cons. And that is that the income can vary depending on your location and the season. At times, I can demand very high rates depending on where I'm at and the time of year, but other times you typically have that pendulum swing where it also may be a little bit less. So although you can command high rent one time of the year, realize that typically there is a pendulum to that where again, you may not be able to demand that high of a rent and your income may vary. The third con that I can come up with in terms of a short-term rental is the excessive turnover. Hopefully you're really, really busy and you've got clients coming and going from the property. Well, every single time somebody leaves the property, I've got to clean it, I've got to prep it, I've got to get it ready. You're also leaning on your cleaners to let you know if anything's wrong with the property. So one set of tenants may leave your property beautiful and in great condition, whereas the second set of clients may come in and be a little destructive. Your cleaners come back and say, hey, your chair's broken, or hey, you're missing some plates, or what have you. So it's that constant need to stay in touch with the property. The turnover is excessive. It's not a set it and forget it kind of mentality like you had with your long-term rentals. It's something that you're constantly reevaluating and having to put energy into, really. That's a lot of pros and cons that we just went over in terms of short-term rentals and long-term rentals. And there's absolutely no way that I can actually pick which one I like over the other. I own multiple Airbnbs and I own multiple long-term rentals in multiple different states. And depending on the time, day, year, month, whatever, I may like one versus the other just because the issues that I'm having with one versus the other. But in general, I would say that being diversified is key. I like to have the consistent income while I like making really a lot of money on my Airbnbs depending on the seasons. Honestly, it's just gonna boil down to what you wanna do, what you're comfortable with, maybe even where you wanna start. For me, I love the fact that I have multiple Airbnbs that I can go and visit, staycations, do vacations, all the fun things. Meanwhile, they could be making me $3,000, $4,000 a month. That's great. I also love my long-term rentals that I have kind of all over the place where it's that steady stream of passive income. I'm about 40 years old. I like that steadiness of it. I like the passive income portion of it. Doesn't mean that I'm not going to keep investing in Airbnbs. Also doesn't mean that I'm not going to keep investing in long-term rentals. There's just a lot to think about in terms of pros and cons and what's going to suit you. That was a lot to cover, I know. A lot of pros and cons on two different topics. Short-term rentals versus long-term rentals. But if you found any of this information useful, I would absolutely love a subscribe, a like, and a few comments. I really enjoy bringing you all this information and really divulging what's worked for me. I hope it works for you, and I'll see you on the next video.